Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to make several advances on the eastern section of the front line within the Donetsk region, into the Kharkiv region in the north, and near the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk border in the south. The Russians made three separate advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians also made numerous advances in the direction of Yablonivka, capturing Oleksandro-Kalinove, and the Russians managed to advance into the Kharkiv region west of the Serebets River line. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to gain control over the southern parts of Shevchenko with a combined assault through the road to the southeast of the town, the first line to the east of the town, and the road to the south of the town. The Russians managed to gain control over the southern parts of Shevchenko, gaining control over the residential area to the south of the river line, and gaining a foothold in the northern bank of the river line as well. This geolocated footage confirms the Russian control over the southern parts of the town, and the push from the east was reported by Deep State Map. With this, the Russians have gained control over half of the town, and this is just south of the defensive line of the Ukrainians here in this region. I've removed the fortifications part of this map. If you want to check out the fortifications, you can go to Playfra or Clement Morin on Twitter. Both of them have their own fortifications maps. It was too cluttering on my map, and the reality of the situation is the current front line, the Russians are facing a single comprehensive line that covers the entire current front line. The Ukrainians do not have any significant lines beyond that. Therefore, we can assume, based on the current front line, that the Russians will continue facing off against fortifications until they go about 5 to 10 kilometers deeper at any point of the front line, and they'll face either the latest or last defensive line. Latest in the sense that the Ukrainians will continue to build as long as they have the ability to do so. The Ukrainians are trying to build some in the rear. However, these are newer fortifications. They are not really that effective compared to the ones from 2014 and since. So we see that the Russians currently are fighting over the last fortified line. Therefore, the assumption going forward in my videos will be that the Russians will fight over fortifications for the next 5 to 10 kilometers. Then there will practically be no more fortifications. The fortifications will be insignificant, and the clutter it causes on the map is not worth having it to show it. Continuing the frontline update and analysis, the Russians managed to capture the town of Zaporizhzhia. This footage here shows the operations take control of it, skipping through most of it, where the Russians launched several artillery strikes, FAB strikes, drone strikes on Ukrainian positions, allowing the Russian soldiers to work on scouting the Ukrainian positions for the targeting long-range distance strikes before raising the flag in one of the streets within the town, confirming the Russian control over the town. The Russians now lack control over the final two towns, Yalta and Sirka, here in between the Vovcha and Mokryali river lines, allowing for Russian control on the southern flank of Dashne for future offensive operations through Novokrenka towards Dashne and into the Dnipropetrovsk region along the highway and the forest lines to the north. The Russians also managed to advance north of Oleksivka, gaining control over the road and additional forest lines connecting the Russian forces from Oleksivka further north towards Bakhtanivka, Turetsky and Horihove. The Russians are here launching offensive operations from the north, the south and the east, gain control over the remaining parts of the border area and push into Dashne, following that into Novopavlivka. Within the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians have already pushed through the fortifications of the Ukrainians, and what they have now is very limited. A few sparse trenches, mostly anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and dragon teeth, which are easily surmountable when there's no trenches and additional fortified lines behind it, which the Russians had in the Surovikin line in the south, allowing them, despite the Ukrainian breakthrough, the anti-tank ditch and dragon teeth, not to be able to establish themselves and create a foothold across. The Russians will be able to do so without the Ukrainian resistance beyond it, forcing the Ukrainians to use a lot more vehicles and armored components for counterattacks and to hold the line in that direction, further increasing the losses they'll be taking in this war of attrition. To the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over Additional ports here northwest of Yablonivka as they continue offensive operations along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the northern flank of Yablonivka to reach the road leading into Stepanivka from the south, to flank Yablonivka from the north, and to secure the eastern flank for offensive operations towards Rusin Yar and Poltavka in the north. At the same time, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Oleksandro-Kalinove, as well as the highway leading up to the town, gaining physical control and physically cutting off the road leading into the pocket formed here west of Toretsk, leaving only the roads here north of the industrial zone remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians are currently storming the industrial zone to gain control of that, increasing the wide area that the Russians will have in control, fire control over the road leading into the pocket, as the Russians continue the operational encirclement of it, which all add up to additional casualties taken by the Ukrainians to hold these towns of Klibenbek, Katerinivka, Novospeske, and Shcherbenivka on the western flank of Toretsk. The Ukrainians are also losing their foothold within the western parts of the city as the Russians are launching offensive operations to the northwest and to the west of the city. The objective is to push the Ukrainians into these towns into a more narrow area to increase the effectiveness of the reconnaissance, drone strikes, artillery strikes, and FAB strikes on Ukrainian positions, which regularly take place whenever the Russians spot a Ukrainian unit to decide on which weapon is most appropriate to attack the Ukrainian position, and then they use it. At the same time, they're establishing anti-tank positions and anti-air positions near the road connecting their forces to the front line, strengthening the Russian positions on the flanks of this operational encirclement to shoot down any drones that will attempt to send supplies over, and any convoys either to supply or to launch a counterattack on the northern flank of Toretsk. Further north in the direction of the Kharkiv region, north of Anove, the Russians are gaining control over the majority of Novy Mir, gaining control over the southern road, residential area, and the forest lines leading up to the town, leaving the northern road and the forest lines to the north of the town under Ukrainian control, splitting the town into half. The Russians have managed to gain control over two roads leading into the town from the south. They'll likely look to expand to the western and eastern flanks now that they've gained a foothold within the town. Getting control over those flanks will strengthen defensive operations and allow for additional pushes into the northern parts of the town. The Russians will continue pushing northwest to gain control over the entire pocket in between the road here to the east. The Russians are looking to advance from the northern and southern flanks to gain control over these towns and settlements along the road and encircle the Ukrainian forces in the area. The Russians are continuing defensive operations by launching these flanking maneuvers on Ukrainian positions. The most fortified positions are being flanked with Russian attacks on the pincers, where they pressure the Ukrainians into a more narrow area, a smaller area, to concentrate as many forces as possible before launching heavy artillery and FAB strikes on the Ukrainian positions. And during these operations, they try to squeeze the Ukrainians into these pockets, where they then leave an exit for the Ukrainians to withdraw through. They then decide to strike while the Ukrainians are on the move, where they mainly use drones. All in all, the Russians continued offensive operations, having the upper hand and the initiative. Despite Ukrainian counterattack attempts, they managed to continuously advance across several sectors of the front line. The Ukrainians are putting up heavy resistance to try to disrupt the Russian momentum. However, so far, the Ukrainians are facing a lot of pressure from the Russian forces. They are not trying to give up their momentum. Without Ukrainian presence within Russian territory and without any Ukrainian offensive operations ongoing, the Russians can work entirely on their offensive operations, dedicating their air force and other units to support these offensive operations. Based on this, we can see that the intensification of Russian offensive operations will continue. Zelensky recently stated that the Russians have 700,000 troops fighting within Ukraine. It is likely more than that, especially counting the Russian units at the border areas. It is closer to 1 million. All of this adds up to a very tough summer as the Russian offensive operations continue and the Ukrainians intensified operations to defend. At the same time, Donald Trump left the G7 meeting early. It is reported since that the reason Trump left the meeting early was because he did not want to meet Zelensky. The NATO summit is coming up in a week's time. It was planned to have 2 meetings with Ukraine and a dinner. Now it has been reduced to 1 meeting and a dinner, and This is to appease Trump and prevent as many meetings as possible between Trump and Zelensky, because Trump is very unhappy with Zelensky as the negotiations are going nowhere. He's also unhappy with Putin. However, with the situation in the Middle East escalating, the Trump administration are increasing pressure on Ukraine and decreasing it on Russia, because Russia has good relations with both Israel and Iran. If the US wants to avoid a direct war with Iran, they need to have diplomacy with Russia, and this turns the whole situation complex. Russia on the international stage has a lot more impact and a much larger role in international politics compared to Ukraine. Ukraine can never play a role as significant as the Russians in a war between Iran and Israel, which is very important for US foreign politics. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.